Welcome to A Date with Darkness podcast, where we will be discussing the impact of hurtful and abusive relationships, as well as racialized trauma, and how to overcome these things so that we can move through our pain to get the kind of healthy relationships we want, need, and deserve. I'm your host, Dr. Natalie Jones. I'm a licensed psychotherapist based out of California. While I hope that you find this podcast educational, informational, and entertaining, please note it should not be substituted for treatment with a licensed mental health professional. Some of the information presented on this podcast can be triggering to some of my listeners, so listener discretion is advised. Thank you so very much for tuning in to today's show. A Happy New Year to you. I have a very special guest, but before we get to that, some of the administrative stuff. Of course, the A Date with Darkness Facebook support group is always online. It's free. It's with other people, both male and female, that are there to support you and that are looking for support from you. So I encourage you to join, and definitely answer some of the questions and post content that you feel is relevant to you in your healing from abusive relationships. As always, if you find the podcast supportive, healing, beneficial to you, please do like and share. It helps the podcast to grow and be seen on Apple Podcast and in the numbers. And also, just share it with someone that you think could benefit from some of the content on there. This show is also on YouTube, so please look for the link for the YouTube video of this episode in the show notes. If you have any questions for me, you have a question that you want me to answer on the show, please do go to my website, adatewithdarkness.com, or email me at adatewithdarkness@gmail.com and specify that you have a question that you would like for me to answer on the show, and I definitely would like to do that. Please try to keep them short and concise. I do get a lot of emails where people write pages upon pages. So just be mindful that I am currently a one-woman show. And so, the more short and concise and to the point, the more that I'm able to answer and read and get back to. So thank you so much. And while I do make a conscious effort to try to read and get back to everyone, it's not always, I'm not always quick to do that due to other obligations. So please know, I definitely do my very best to try to respond and get back to everyone. And I do thank you so much for your support and for listening and sharing this time with me. So without further ado, I do want to introduce my guest, licensed psychotherapist and author, Beverly Engel is back on the show. She has a new book out about healing from emotional abuse, and she will be here. She's going to come on today to talk about that book. So without further ado, here is the interview with Beverly Engel. Hi, Beverly. Welcome to the show again.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be on again with you. The last interview was so great. I'm glad to be on again.
That's awesome. I'm glad to have you here. And, I'm a longtime fan of the books and the work that you've done. I feel like a lot of the stuff we talk about is very similar. So I'm excited to do today's show with you.
Yeah, great.
Awesome. So, since we talked last time, why don't you tell us a little bit, about who you are, what drives the passion behind your work, in case there's a listener that's listening for the first time and just they're dropping in just to check this show out.
Okay. Well, I've been a therapist for almost 40 years, and I started working with emotional abuse in particular because I was just working with the general population at first, the beginning of my career. Mm-hmm. But I noticed that there were so many people who were coming in and describing emotional abuse. They weren't labeling it emotional abuse. Mm-hmm. They would come in fact, and say that there was something wrong with them. They weren't a good wife, or they weren't a good husband. Their wife or husband was never happy with them. They were just a failure in life. No matter how hard they tried, they could never make their partner happy. Their partner was constantly unhappy and giving them the silent treatment. And they just knew that there was something majorly wrong with them. Otherwise, their partner would be happier with them. They didn't want to have sex with their partner anymore. They didn't feel like even being close to him or her. And so what we figured out together was that it really wasn't that there was something wrong with them. It was that they were being emotionally abused, that their partner was a kind of a person who would never be happy with anybody, who always complained about everybody, who always punished people with the silent treatment or yelling at them or being constantly critical. And so I just kept noticing this trend of people coming in who've been emotionally abused. Now, my practice had been a lot of people who were either sexually abused or physically abused, but this emotional abuse, like when I first started noticing it, was new to me. It was new to me until I remembered that that's how I was treated growing up. And I put two and two together, that I actually had been emotionally abused by my mother growing up, who was never pleased with me, who was always critical, who was always ashamed of me, who always sent the message that there was something wrong with me, that I was a disappointment to her, that I was always letting her down. And so I started focusing on emotional abuse. I wrote the very first book on emotional abuse, in fact. That was, I guess, 30 years ago or something? I don't know. And so that's where it began, with me noticing with my clients, but also making the connection with my own problems and the fact that I had been emotionally abused as a child.
That's awesome. And for people who don't know, and also too, for people who maybe do have an idea, but there's so many variations of it. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly is emotional abuse?
Yeah. Emotional abuse typically is any non-physical behavior that is intended to control, humiliate, demean, belittle a partner. Okay, it can be, or a person.
Yeah.
The intention usually is deliberate. It's a deliberate attempt to keep a person down, to make them question their own self-concept. It gets to the point with emotional abuse where the person actually begins to question their sanity. They question their perceptions, they question their sanity, because their partner, we've heard a lot now about gaslighting, their partner's constantly denying things that actually happened, or accusing them of things that they know didn't happen, but they get confused. Emotional abuse causes a great deal of confusion in the victim's mind. They feel like something happened, and yet their partner said it didn't happen. They are sure they didn't do something, and yet their partner is accusing them of it. So slowly, it's like brainwashing. The victim begins to doubt themselves, doubt their perceptions. And there's many different forms of emotional abuse, but basically it's about control and humiliation and belittling and trying to make a partner feel bad about themselves or question themselves.
For those who are the abusers, can you talk a little bit about why you think people are emotionally abusive?
Yeah, I put abusers into two general categories. One is the intentional abuser, and the other is the unintentional. Now, I just told you that the definition was to be deliberately trying to undermine a partner, but there are abusers who aren't intentionally doing it. They're doing it because they were raised with an emotionally abusive parent. They either witnessed their parents emotionally abusing each other, or one or both of their parents emotionally abuse them. And they're just kind of blindly repeating that behavior. This is the abuser, that if the victim can get the courage to confront him and say, look, this is the way you're treating me, and this is the way it makes me feel, the unintentional abuser's reaction will often be, oh my God, I didn't realize that was hurting you. That's just how I was raised. That's just normal for me. I'm just used to that kind of treatment. That kind of abuser is more likely to be able to change, to stop the abuse. The intentional abuser is more the classic definition that I just gave, who's deliberately trying to control, who's deliberately trying to demean and keep their partner down. Now, they may have the same origin of their abuse. They may also have been emotionally abused, but they're deliberately doing this now. They've been so shamed as a child or as an adult that they've developed this wall. They've created a wall, a defensive wall, to keep out any more shame. It's like I had one client, one abuser tell me, I'm up to here with shame. I can't take anymore.
Wow.
And so I can't take any more criticism. I can't take anybody else telling me I'm wrong. I just shut it out. And that's what abusers do. They can't take any criticism, or they think they can't. I can't take any criticism or even any constructive criticism because it makes them feel so horrible about themselves. So they've created a whole system of protecting themselves from shame. They criticize before somebody else has a chance to criticize them. They're always on the defense. They're always right in their own mind. They're just not open to anybody telling them anything that they could correct. And so that's how they defend themselves from shame. That kind of abuser is the kind that it's very difficult for them to ever make change. They could go to therapy, and they need to go to therapy in order to make change. But even therapy isn't necessarily going to work for them because they need to be vulnerable. They need to open up with the therapist and tell the therapist the truth about themselves and tell themselves the truths to themselves so they can begin to heal. They need to be able to cry and get angry and express their emotions about their own wounding. And seldom can they do that. They're so defended that they just can't do that. They can't open up to somebody, even a therapist they've learned to trust. And so they typically don't last very long. They just can't. They may even have a good connection with the therapist. And I've worked with many abusers who had a good connection with me, who admitted they were wrong, who wanted to change because they wanted their partner back, who started to make some changes. But they found that it was just too hard. They were too vulnerable. They didn't voice that to me, but they started missing sessions and telling me that they had grown a lot. They didn't feel like they needed it anymore. They could just go so deep. So most abusers like that, the ones that are so defended, really can't get better, even if they want to. Most of them, of that intentional group, don't even want to get better. They're convinced that everything is everybody else's fault, that the reason why their wife or their partner is so unhappy is their problem, that it has nothing to do with them. They're perfect. But those are the two types of abusers, generally speaking, that I've worked with.
And I would definitely agree with you there. I've seen a lot of that in my work as well. I'm curious to know, in your expert opinion, systemically speaking, and it's you probably have noticed this, and maybe have seen some changes, considering how long you've been doing the work that you do. But systemically speaking, emotional abuse is not typically recognized as how should I word it, as severe as other types of abuse. And, it often gets dismissed, or, it often is minimized. And can you talk a little bit about why you think that may be the case?
Well, it's, with physical abuse, you can see the wounds, you can see the bruises. It's obvious. Although a lot of people who are being physically abused stay in denial about that too. But it's more obvious. Emotional abuse is less obvious. It's very insidious. It's not clear to the victim that they're even being emotionally abused. Now, if they were to start talking about it, which they don't do, if they were to start talking about it with their friends and neighbors, it still might not be clear
Sure.
to their partner, to their friends, what's
Yeah.
going on. Their friends would still kind of minimize it and compare it to physical abuse. But what we found, research has found that emotional abuse is actually more damaging
Yes.
than physical abuse for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's so hidden and it lasts longer usually. But also, what happens is that somebody who's being emotionally abused, it tends to be constant. It tends to be consistent with no breaks. And we've learned with research that those people who are being abused who don't have a break, like a child who's being sexually abused all the time when they're a child with no breaks. They don't get to go to grandma's during the summer and have a break from it. The person who sexually abuses them for a long time. Those people end up having more psychological problems. Those people who were abused as a child who have breaks, they go to grandma's in the summer. They have a nice aunt who takes them on the weekends sometimes. Those breaks are important because it gives them time to heal. It gives them time to come out of the dissociation, out of the terror of what's happening to them. And those little breaks helps them to heal. And those people, research has shown, don't have as many serious psychological problems as those where it's constant. So emotional abuse is constant. There's seldom a break, okay, unless she goes on vacation or something with somebody, which is unlikely. Because the abusers typically want to control them and wouldn't let them go on a vacation. So they are typically consistently abused day after day after day with no breaks and no time to heal. And that causes more psychological problems in the future. Okay, so there's several reasons why emotional abuse is actually more damaging.
And I would actually even argue that it's probably compounded by the fact that it's so minimized or dismissed. That adds an extra layer to that, like, when people say get over it, or it's just words, or you need to move on, or it's not that bad. The minimization adds that extra layer and compounds to that and adds to that the being hidden, the being shamed, and just the complete disregard of feelings and things of that nature.
Right, that's a really good point. Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Okay. And so, so those are excellent points. And I think there's also a difference between being raised versus perhaps marrying into or having a partner. Those dynamics are different. Being, like you said, you can't escape. So I do want to definitely dive into the new book. Tell us about the new book, or the book that you've written, but it took a little bit to get published. Tell us about it.
It's called Escaping Emotional Abuse, and the subtitle is Healing the Shame That You Don't Deserve. So it's about emotional abuse, but there's a focus on shame. Emotional abuse, really the biggest, the most intense damage that's caused by emotional abuse is the shame that it causes in the victim. It's very humiliating to have someone always put you down in front of other people, always criticize you, never be happy. The shame is devastating. It causes people to feel completely unworthy, unlovable. They become convinced that nobody else would ever want them. So I wanted to focus on shame because it hadn't been focused on in conjunction with emotional abuse enough, as far as I was concerned.
Can you clarify what shame is? Can you break that down for us? Because I feel like that's a little word with a big meaning that a lot of people, again, they kind of glaze over it and they think they know, but they don't know necessarily.
Shame is a physical emotion and an emotional reaction, just like anger or fear or sadness. But it's very different in another sense, and that is that shame is like a state of being. It's not just a feeling in the moment. It's a whole state of being that the person takes on, where they feel like a failure. Like I said, they feel worthless, they feel hopeless, they feel helpless, they feel like there's nothing they can do. They're so ashamed, they feel like nobody would ever want them, that they're unlovable. And it can affect posture. A person who's shamed will often slump their shoulders and hold their head down, and they won't be able to look you in the eye. It can affect the way that they see themselves in comparison to others. They just see themselves as less than, as inadequate. It affects the whole person, affects the posture, the emotions, the state of mind. So I say it's like a state of being more than just a feeling like anger or sadness or fear. And it's devastating. I call it debilitating shame. Some people call it toxic shame. It's very debilitating. It changes the person's outlook on life and their self-concept, their self-esteem. Like I said before, their perceptions of themselves. It's a huge emotional state that's very devastating.
Mm. What makes it so difficult for people to shift from that emotional state?
Well, they need the opposite. They either need, and in my book I outline like 5 steps. They either need to trade that shame in for anger and stop blaming themselves, stop taking their anger and the abuser's anger out on themselves, and externalize their anger. Because if you're treated that way, you're going to be angry. But most victims aren't aware of their anger, or they think their anger is wrong, or they're afraid of their anger. So externalizing your anger takes the shame out of you and puts it where it belongs. There's even an exercise I have clients do where they actually visualize the shame in their body, reach in and get it with their hand, and then throw the shame back to the abuser. So that's what anger does. It throws the shame back to who caused the shame. Okay. So shame needs a lot of help to move it. It either needs taking it out of the body and giving it back. It takes really a self-understanding that I haven't done anything wrong, that this is the abuser's fault. This is the abuser's problem. It's not mine. I'm not the things that the abuser is saying to me. So my very first step is a kind of a reprogramming, where I encourage victims to stop believing the abuser, stop believing their lies. Abusers typically lie a lot. Stop believing their lies. Stop putting them on a pedestal. Stop thinking of them as the teacher, because abusers very often see themselves as the enlightened one, the teacher, the expert, the superior person, and they're talking down to the victim. They're telling the victim what she should do, how she should feel, how she should think. And so victims need to stop giving that power to the abuser. They need to actually stop seeing the abuser as better than them and begin to question what the abuser says, begin to question what's really going on here. So that's it. Shame needs to be confronted, and the person needs to say, wait a minute, I'm not going to take on this shame. Okay. But shame also, probably the most important thing, is that shame needs self-compassion. The opposite of shame is compassion. That's basically how to heal shame. You need to be able to provide yourself with self-compassion. It nullifies shame. It neutralizes shame. And what I mean by self-compassion is to, again, understand that, I'm suffering. Compassion is about suffering. I'm suffering, and I need to receive some empathy and some compassion in order to heal that suffering. And so the exercise I always have people do with learning how to have compassion is to think of somebody who's been kind to you in your life. Most people can think of at least one person, a teacher, a grandma, somebody who was kind to them, who saw their suffering, who validated their suffering. And think of that person. And if you can't think of a person, think of a person in fiction or in a movie who seemed to be a kind person. and remember what that felt like, or imagine what it felt like if that person could see, really saw you, really validated your feelings, was really kind to you. How would that feel, or how did that feel when you received that kindness, when you received that compassion? And that's the kind of compassion you need to give yourself. If you can even remember the words that were said to you, you can use those words. Okay. Some people don't have any experience like that. So I ask them just to, if they have a pet, how do you talk to your pet?
Yeah.
Talk to yourself as kindly as you talk to your pet. Learn to talk to yourself and say, I see you're suffering. I know you're suffering. I'm sorry what you're going through. I'm sorry that you're being so abused. You know, you don't deserve that. So it's a whole way of learning to give yourself the compassion you need in order to heal your shame. It's a long answer to your question.
No, but it's good. It's good. It is a very valuable answer. So thank you so much. I really do appreciate that. As you were talking, I'm wondering, when you're working with these clients that come to you with shame and who've been emotionally abused, what is their biggest misconception or misunderstanding, perhaps, of emotional abuse and shame?
What is my reaction to it?
No, what's their biggest misunderstanding
Oh,
or
misunderstanding. Yeah,
misperception of that?
yeah. Well, the biggest misperception, once again, is that it's their fault. It's their fault that they're being criticized. It's their fault that their partner isn't happy, and that the shame they feel is deserved, that they deserve to be shamed. They deserve to be humiliated. Maybe that feeling of that they deserve it comes from childhood. It may, the abuser may not be the only person who's abused them, they may have a history. And that if they have a history of believing they don't deserve good things, or they don't deserve to be loved, and they take that into the marriage, then the abuser, has a lot more power. But it can just be that they had a good childhood and they got involved in a relationship where they were shamed. But it's the feeling that I don't deserve it, I'm unworthy. And that's why this is happening. I need to help them see, no, your partner is not a happy person. Think about who your partner is. He's always getting into arguments at work. He feels like a failure at work. When he comes home and there's been something that's happened at work that wasn't good, wasn't positive, he takes it out on you, and he takes it out on the children. He's kind of a rageaholic. He's always angry. He's always angry at somebody. So take a clear look at who your partner is and stop believing that you're causing his behavior. What I always talk about is that abusers and victims tend to process things differently. A victim, if there's something going on inside of her, she doesn't feel good, she feels insecure, she feels nervous, she will tend to look into herself. She will, first of all, blame herself for her own feelings, and she will look inside to say, what's going on with me? An abuser, if he's uncomfortable, if he's nervous, the first thing he does is go outside himself, and he blames somebody else. It's always somebody else who's to blame for his feelings, for his nervousness, for his agitation. It's always somebody else. So they view the world in completely opposite ways. And I encourage victims to say, wait a minute, when I'm nervous, when I'm anxious around my partner, maybe it's not me. Maybe it's him. It's a new thought for them. It's a new thought to go outside themselves and say, maybe I'm not the one who's causing this. Maybe he has the problem. That's a pivotal point when they begin to see that, when they begin to see, I'm not so bad. He's really the one who's always unhappy.
Yeah, and I think I want to take a second to pause for a second, because if I have someone who's listening to the show and they're in the thick of it, right? They're in the thick of an emotionally abusive relationship or marriage. Can you talk a little bit about what specific signs they can look for within that? Because I think that a lot of people at least come to me and say, well, they're just saying that because they love me, or they only did that this one time, or just sort of any sort of justification. Can you
Right.
can you talk about some clear cut, like, no, this is what it is? Can you kind of give us a rundown of that?
Again, you make a really good point, because most victims of emotional abuse will be in denial. They will minimize it. So yeah, I mentioned confusion earlier. I ask people to think about how often they're confused, about who they are, about the relationship, about what they're doing wrong. So confusion is a really big red flag.
Sure.
A lot of people who are emotionally abused are depressed, and they don't recognize they're depressed. So the signs of depression are that you don't feel motivated, and that's interesting, because abusers often call their victims lazy. They say, you're lazy, why don't you do more? Well, if you're depressed, you're not going to be motivated. You're not going to have the energy. So your energy is depleted. So lack of motivation is often a sign of depression. Feeling kind of like you're out of your body, dissociation, is another red flag. When you're being abused or mistreated, it's very difficult to stay in your body and take it. And so our system has created a way for us to escape that. And that is dissociation. We think of that more like with sexual abuse, where the child goes out of their body while they're being sexually abused. But it happens with emotional abuse. It happens with any kind of abuse.
Yes.
The person goes out of their body and they're not in the present.
Yes.
They may be focused on a light bulb. They may be in a fantasy, but they're not connected to the present. And that's a safety mechanism. That's a survival mechanism.
Yes.
But if you end up walking around constantly not in your body, if you're not present, that's kind of a dangerous state.
I agree.
You can't take care of yourself if you're
agree.
not in your body. So that's another sign, is dissociation.
I agree.
So confusion, depression, dissociation. And with depression, there's that, again, the feeling of hopelessness and helplessness, that I can't really do anything about this. The longer they stay in the relationship, they feel more and more helpless. They don't have a connection with their own energy and their own power to change, their own agency to change the situation. They stop seeing options for change. They're just stuck. They can't do anything about it, and they just kind of give up. So when somebody feels that kind of depression or confusion or dissociation constantly, those are really huge red flags.
Excellent points, and I totally agree with you. Talk a little bit about the yes, but people. Yes, but I want to know what I can do to save my relationship with my partner. How can we fix me or fix this so that we can still stay together?
Well, again, I go back to the point that very often it's not about fixing you. That's what the abuser has tried to convince you of, that it's you. So getting a more objective view and not seeing him, not putting him on a pedestal, and not seeing him as all perfect, but that he has faults too. But if somebody really is in that yes, but, then there's some ways to sit down with your partner and talk about it. Talk about, it's very scary for a lot of people to do that, but talk about, look, we're both unhappy. You're unhappy with me. I'm never giving you enough. I'm never pleasing you. And I'm unhappy because I feel like such a failure. So what can we do? I'm willing to go to therapy. Are you willing to go to therapy?
Sure.
That's a good question. I never encourage, I'm sure you agree, for them to go to therapy together. You never have couples therapy for somebody who's being emotionally abused.
I agree.
The therapist won't see a clear picture of what's really going on, because the abused person will stay quiet, and the abuser will be more than happy to explain how it's always the other person's fault, and there won't be a clear picture.
I agree.
And the therapist won't be able to really be objective and see what's going on. But are you willing to go to therapy alone? I will go to therapy alone. And if he won't go to therapy, and I'm saying he, but I really want to make a point, there are females who are emotional abusers, and there are men who are being abused.
Yes.
But if he's not willing to go to therapy, say, okay, I will go to therapy. I will go to therapy to see what I can do to change our relationship. I wish you would too, but I will go to therapy because we want her or him to go to therapy. We want her or him to get an outside perspective of what's going on. We want her or him to get the help they need. No, it's not going to help the marriage or the relationship, but may help her. It may help her to get a clearer picture of what's happening.
I agree.
So many victims of emotional abuse don't ever talk to their partner about how they're feeling. They're afraid to. They're afraid to, or they've tried in the past and he won't listen. So they give up. But I encourage them to try again. If they're going to have that attitude that, yes, but, then I want to say, okay, make it clear that you're unhappy. Make it clear exactly what he does or she does that makes you unhappy. At least do that, okay? He or she may not listen, may turn it around on you. Yes, we know you've tried, but try doing it. It'll make you feel better that you've said your piece. It'll help make you stronger. It might make it clearer to you what's really going on here. But you need to state what's going on. You need to say it. And there's an outside chance that maybe your partner might hear you, okay? But if your partner isn't going to hear you, there really isn't any chance for the relationship other than you going to therapy, you getting stronger so that you can leave.
I agree with those points also. In the book, you talk about how to know when it's time to end the relationship. Can you talk a little bit about when it's time to leave?
Yeah. Well, absolutely, it's time to leave when you can see how it's affecting your children. You can see that your son is becoming a bully at school, mimicking his father. Okay. You can see how your teenage daughter has a boyfriend and she's repeating your behavior and being victimized by her boyfriend. Okay. So that's number one. If you can see how it's affecting your children, you have a child who won't speak, a scared 4-year-old who won't speak yet. It's probably because his father's yelled at him all the time and yelling at you. So a lot of mothers will say, yeah, when I start to see it in my children, when I start to see them either being affected by his behavior or our behavior, or when I start to see them repeating our behavior, that's the time they often are willing to leave. And that's a time when they should leave, when they start to see it. And make no mistake about it, they may not show signs that they're being affected, but they're being affected.
I agree.
They're being affected by seeing you take the abuse, and they're being affected by watching and hearing their father or your partner abusing you. They're being affected by it. Another red flag or time to leave is when you start fantasizing about killing your partner. And that may sound extreme, but if you've held your anger in for so long and you're afraid to express your anger and you're starting to fantasize about killing him, not that you would really do it probably, although it's possible, but once you start to fantasize like that, that's telling you that you feel so hopeless and helpless that you really need to get out of there.
Wow.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I would definitely agree.
Yeah.
I would definitely agree that, a lot of people, which brings me to the next question about people who choose to stay. A lot of people sort of minimize or, delay leaving because they feel like she's a good mother or she's a good father. It's just me who's getting that because maybe they don't see their children being impacted by it. And just because you don't get to see it right away doesn't mean that they're being impacted. Many children experience what's called the sleeper effect. and that you
Yes.
don't get to see it until much later or until certain situations present themselves. So I definitely agree with you, and I can't stress that enough, that children are being impacted by you. And whether or not that person is abusive to the children or not, just by the fact that they're abusing you, they're still being abused.
Right. And they likely are abusing the children.
Yeah.
It may be subtle. It's again,
Yes.
maybe the unreasonable
Yes.
expectations, the being angry that the kid isn't getting good enough grades, being angry that the kid isn't performing well enough in sports or music or whatever.
Hmm.
So that, it's subtle, but it's the constant message
Yes.
again, the same message you're getting,
Yes.
that you're not good enough. There's something wrong with you. You'll never be good enough. You'll never please me. So they probably are being emotionally
Yes.
abused.
I would agree. What do you do with those, or how do you help people manage um, if they choose to stay?
Yeah. Um, it depends on the type of abuser they've got, the type of experience they're having. Um, if it's, abuse is never mild, but if it's on the mild end of the continuum, I just encourage them to try to go out more in their life, make friends, go back to school, have other connections with people,
Hmm.
get out of this confined space where you're constantly being told by one person
Yeah.
that you're not good enough. Go out and find out that you are good enough in something.
Yeah.
Go out and make friends who accept you the way you are. Go out and have a social life if you can. If your abuser is the kind that's completely controlling you and you can't go out and do anything, of course that's not going to work. But even so, even if your abuser is that controlling, the internet is a great place. You can go on. Now we have Zoom meetings. You can join. You can even join a support group on the internet.
Hmm.
You can join a support group for emotionally abused women or emotionally abused men. It's incredible what's offered. So even if your partner is so controlling that he won't allow you to go out and make friends and go out and go back to school or whatever, you can go back to school online. Okay, you can get a degree online, and you can certainly go to a support group online. But you need to reach out. You need to get beyond the influence of your partner so
Yeah.
that you can begin to change your perception of yourself. Um, Work on self-compassion, work on self-kindness. That's
Hmm.
another step. Most people who are being abused are not kind to themselves. They don't treat themselves well. We hear about self-care all the time, but it is important. Don't neglect yourself. Don't neglect your body. Eat healthy, exercise, go to the spa, go get a massage, get some caring, get some loving, you know, just hold yourself, put your arms around yourself and comfort yourself and
Hmm.
say, I know you're suffering. I know it's hard, but you're a good person. We're going to make it, kind of touch your arm and soothe yourself, soothe your arm. Um, Kristen Neff, who was the pioneer in working with self-compassion, talked about creating an internal nurturing voice inside yourself, creating an internal nurturing voice. And that is to counter the inner critic that we all have, but that people who are being abused have in spades. You want to quiet that internal critical voice. We all have it, but if you're being abused, your critical voice is really loud. You can hardly do anything without hearing, oh, you're stupid. Why did you do it that way? Why are you always making mistakes? And your internal critical voice often sounds like your abuser. It may sound like your original abuser, your parent,
Yeah.
or it may sound like your current abuser. So you want to be able to learn to go inside, and I can't really go through all how you get there.
Yeah.
But in my book, I talk about it. In Kristen Neff, it's
Yeah.
Neff, in her books. You can even go on her website,
Yeah.
and she has meditations that teach you how to go inside yourself. When I say go inside, a lot of people don't even know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So, but she has a wonderful meditation. She has a wonderful voice, and it's very calming and very soothing. And if you do nothing else, go on her website and listen to the meditation, and
Yes.
it will help you learn to go inside and how to comfort yourself and
Yes.
how to nurture yourself.
Yeah, she has wonderful work, and I'll be sure to link her stuff in the show notes. Her self-compassion book also.
Yes.
Last question for you with respect to the book: how to fight or resist the temptation to go back if you've left. I
Yeah.
think that's one of the biggest doozies that people find themselves in terms of leaving, and they want to check social media, or they wonder if that person misses them, or their partner is moving on and has found someone else. So now there's like this sort of like, wait a minute,
Yeah.
knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah.
How do we get
Or
that? Yeah,
yeah,
go
or
ahead.
their partner is swearing that he's changed,
Oh yeah. Oh
and
yeah.
please come back and I'll prove to you that I'm different and it's going to be better. So
Absolutely.
yes, that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
I do encourage people in the very beginning of the book to keep a journal, start keeping a journal of the times when you are being emotionally abused, when you can say that I'm being emotionally abused. Describe it in detail and include how it makes you feel.
Yes.
We went to a party the other day, and he was criticizing me in front of everybody and making fun of me and everybody in front of everybody. And I felt so and so. I felt so ashamed. I felt so angry. I felt so sad. So keep a journal. And I asked them to periodically go through the journal to remind themselves that they're being emotionally abused.
Yes.
Then when they do leave, if they do leave, go back and look at that journal. Go back and remind yourself of what it was really like. When you start wavering and thinking it wasn't so bad, go back and read how it really was. If you haven't kept a journal, just remind yourself of how bad it was, how bad it got. What I also ask people to do is pay attention to how you're feeling now. Yes, you're probably sad and you're grieving and you're afraid you're not going to make it. But look for some positive signs of what's happened since you've left.
Yeah.
How are you feeling since you've left?
Yeah.
What are your friends telling you? Are they saying, wow, you look so much better? Wow, you seem so much more relaxed. Are
Mm-hmm.
your kids saying, Mommy, you're so much nicer, you're so much more relaxed, you're so much more fun? Pay attention to how you've changed since you've left. What's happened from a positive note of what you're like now versus who you were before when you were with him.
Excellent. Excellent. And those are all great tips and suggestions. And I'm definitely excited for you and your new book. Tell people how they can find you or communicate with you if they want to get in touch with you after listening to
Yeah.
this wonderful show.
Well, my email address is just Beverly Engel, ENGEL.com,
Yeah.
and they can connect with me through email. They can go on Amazon or any internet
Yeah.
bookseller and find the book.
Yeah.
I have a website called Heal My Shame, and they can go there and find all kinds of articles and all kinds of news items about me, and they can connect through there. There's a contact through Heal My Shame. And I have a regular website, www.beverlyengel.com, and they
Nice.
can go there and they can connect with me through that website.
Definitely. We'll link those in the show notes. Any upcoming projects or things that you're working on that we can support you with?
No, I just want to focus on this book and
Awesome.
get through the pandemic like everybody else.
Right? I know. Well, I appreciate you for coming on the show and sharing so much of your knowledge and wisdom. It's always great to have you up here. And I'm excited to really dive deep in this book. And I'm definitely going to be recommending it and linking it in the show notes.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you. And I appreciate you. I always appreciate your questions. They're always in depth. They're always thoughtful. You're a really good interviewer. So I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate that.
Thank you so much. All right. So I felt like that conversation was very informative. I absolutely love when Beverly comes on, I think her years of experience and compassion and wisdom shine through like no other. And she just has a way of just sort of simplifying that information that is relatable, that you can understand. And it just really hits a nerve every single time. It's like, oh, that happened to me, or I've experienced that, or I know someone who's going through that right now. And so, yeah, I always love interviewing her because it's like, oh, and her books stay so relevant over the years. So I'll definitely put a link to her books, her website, and also Dr. Neff's stuff in the comments down below. And also, let's keep the conversation going, and connect with me on Instagram, on Facebook, and on YouTube. I love to listen to or interact with listeners and read the comments and respond back to them. So thank you so very much. And until next time, I hope you're all staying safe in the new year, and be well.